All right, guys. We are going to go ahead and get started. We're looking at period 7, the timeline. The dates are 1890 to 1945. What you're going to want to do is write down these events in order. It helps for you to understand contextualization. So, from how events were shaped and how eras were shaped. As you're writing them down, I'm just going to give you a little bit of fact about it. If you don't know these facts, maybe you can write them down, but honestly, most of this should be review for you. There's only a couple events on here that we haven't talked about in detail. Let's get started. So 1890, the reason why this starts in 1890 is mainly because of the Sherman Antitrust Act that came out in 1890. And this is kind of considered the official start of the Progressive Era. The Gilded Age, which was before this, was kind of where monopolies ran control of everything, society, the government, all of that. The Sherman Antitrust Act was created in a way to try to stop some of these monopolistic ideas. 1898 is the next one. It's a nice big jump. 1898 is the Spanish-American War. This was between the United States and Spain. And this really kickstarts the imperialism era of the United States because it's from the Spanish-American War that we're going to get several different places: Guam, Puerto Rico, Cuba, and then the Philippines, which leads us to our next event, which is 1898 to 1902, the Philippine-American War. This is where the United States is actually going to fight the Philippines after rescuing them from the Spanish. And this is because the Filipino people wanted to be independent. The United States wanted to control the Philippines for several reasons, but the major reason is it was right next to China. In 1899, the United States is going to establish the open door policy in China. This was to limit trade barriers. And this is a big idea in American history, which is that we should be able to trade with everyone. Beforehand, the European powers were trying to control different segments of China. The United States wants China to be open to everyone. Your next event is one that we haven't talked about directly. It's 1903, and it's the publication by W.E.B. Du Bois, which is The Souls of Black Folk. And this was kind of W.E.B.'s national coming out party. It's where he became a huge leader in the Black community, striving for equality. And it's going to ultimately end up in 1909, a little bonus event for you, which is the establishment of the NAACP, because WEB started the NAACP. All right. 1904, you have the first child labor laws. This kind of, again, is a big idea in the progressive era, which is that labor needs to be protected, even from itself, so that there should be age restrictions and children should not work in dangerous factories. 1904 as well is the construction of the Panama Canal. Panama Canal is going to be started in 1904. Wasn't finished for a while. I want to say 7 years. 1911 is the year coming in my mind. But this is the start of it. This is when imperialism is in full go. We have gotten Panama free, so we can start this Panama Canal. And you'll see with the next event that Teddy Roosevelt is leading the corollary. This was the idea that the United States may have to militarily intervene in Latin American countries to ensure that the Monroe Doctrine is followed, meaning that European countries stay out. This creates the idea of what's called a protectorate, which is basically where the United States will come into a country to protect it from itself. This is a big idea that has some racial ideas behind it, some superiority ideas behind it, which is basically that the United States knows what to do with your country better than you do. 1906, The Jungle is published. This is back to the progressive era. So this is why I like seeing these timelines, so you can kind of see that imperialism and the progressive era is running side by side with each other. The Jungle was to expose the meatpacking industry. Upton Sinclair was a muckraker. 1913, jumping ahead a little bit, we have the 16th Amendment and the Federal Reserve created. And I put these two events together because they were both trying to tackle the idea of what our modern economy was going to look like. The 16th Amendment creates a income tax. So it's this idea that the rich are going to be taxed to try to help some of the poor, creating wealth equality. And then the Federal Reserve was created to try to stop some of the corruption in banking. 1914, World War I begins in Europe. This is when Archduke Franz Ferdinand was killed in the United States. Remember, they're wanting to try to practice neutrality for a while, but different events keep getting in their way, one of which is the 1915 sinking of the Lusitania. This was a famous picture that was called Remember the Children of the Lusitania. These are the ghosts of all the children who died on the Lusitania, which was sunk by a German U-boat. Germany's going to stop their submarine warfare for a little bit, but eventually pick it back up. 1917, the Great Migration hits its peak. One thing I don't stress too much is that the Great Migration went on for about 10 to 15 years. And it's in 1917 that it's at its absolute climax. This is when Black people are moving from the rural South to the North to find industry jobs. As they move up there, they're going to change a massive part of their culture or celebrate a big part of their culture. And this is called the Harlem Renaissance, which is this big celebration of what it means to be African American. Leads to lots of different arts, including the creation of jazz. 1917 is also when the Zimmermann telegram is sent. This was Germany trying to get Mexico to invade the United States. The United States and Mexico had been having some problems, mainly because of this Roosevelt corollary, which had continued on with Woodrow Wilson and his moral diplomacy. And the United States is going to intercept this telegram, and we are going to declare war on Germany. Right? So the war is going to end in 1918. Before the war even ends, though, January 1918, Woodrow Wilson reveals what's called the 14 points. And this was this idea that we could create a peace forever. This would be the war to end all wars. But there was one major problem with this for the United States. It would force them to join something called League of Nations, which meant that the United States was not going to be able to practice isolationism anymore. The United States does not like this idea, and because of this, the 14 points is not going to be followed even really by the United States. Additionally, France and the British, they don't want real peace. They want to punish Germany for the war. So when the war ends in 1918, it ends with what's called an armistice, which basically means that they're going to come to the peace table and talk. However, the talking will not be very equal. In 1919 to 1920, it starts the Red Scare. There was a ton of propaganda that came out during World War I against European immigrants and some of the radical ideas of Europeans. This was so effective that actually people began to hate European immigrants in the United States. And it created this fear that communism and these radical ideas like anarchy were going to come into the United States and destroy the society. So because of that, we began to limit immigration. The 1919 also created the 18th Amendment. Now, I put this picture up here just to kind of confuse you a little bit. The 18th Amendment is going to ban alcohol. The 19th Amendment created the women's rights to vote. That happened in 1920. But if you look at this picture, you'll see that it's a woman. So why do I have a woman up here if it's 18th Amendment, which bans alcohol? And it's because if you look at her leg, this was a fancy little device that she had, which actually would hide a flask so that she could drink in secret. 1919, this is also an event that we have not talked about that much, but it's called the Red Summer. So all these African Americans moved up to the United States for these factory jobs, and then all these soldiers came home, and they were not happy that Black people had moved into either their neighborhoods or into their jobs. And so because of that, there were huge race riots. The biggest one, which is in Chicago, which is actually pictured here, went on for a long time. And people begged for the federal government to intervene, but they did not. And this is a big, big flaw of Woodrow Wilson, which was that he was a big-time racist. All right, 1919, the Treaty of Versailles is signed. One person you won't really notice here, well, one thing about this treaty is that the United States did not sign it. It's because if you signed this treaty, you would have joined the League of Nations, and the United States didn't want to join the League of Nations. So because of that, we actually signed a separate treaty with Germany. All right, 1920, you have the 19th Amendment, which is created. This picture has nothing to do with the 19th Amendment, but you know what? We make mistakes. Let's just keep going. 19th Amendment, women get the right to vote. 1924, the National Origins Act. This is the most intense labor immigration law that had been put into place. It started in 1921. You had the Quota Act of 1921. 1924 becomes even more intense. Basically, no European from Southern or Eastern Europe is going to be allowed. That's going to ban Russians, Polish Jews, and Italians. Germans could still come if they wanted to, but mainly they wanted the British to be able to come only. This also basically banned all Asian immigration. 1924, The Great Gatsby is also published, written by a guy named F. Scott Fitzgerald, part of this thing called The Lost Generation. And this is where he began to criticize contemporary American society for their mass consumerism. If you go see the movie The Great Gatsby, you don't really notice that theme as much, but in the book, it is heavily influenced. Then 1929, you have the Wall Street crash that starts the Great Depression. This is when the stock market began to crash because of overproduction and underconsumption, which leads to the Great Depression. 1931 to 1939, this is where the 1930s really sucks because the Dust Bowl is going on at the same time. Bad farming practices and drought had led to where all the topsoil had been removed, leaving loose dust. There were these powerful windstorms that came through, and when these powerful windstorms came through, they picked up all this dust, causing people to eventually evacuate. Millions of people moved from the Midwest to California. 1932, FDR is elected. Herbert Hoover got destroyed. He had no idea what to do when the Great Depression came out. So because of that, you can see FDR, not only did he win, he destroyed Herbert Hoover. 1933, the first fireside chat happened. This was FDR's idea to embrace new technology to try to gain a new insight into the American psyche. It worked well, and he introduced a New Deal, his plan to get rid of the Great Depression. Part of that, two acts which were created in 1939. One is the Wagner Act. This allows for you to join a union. And then you also have the Social Security, which created retirement. Both of these are significant for a couple of reasons. One, Social Security is going to mean that the government's going to look after you. They want to be able to help you. That kind of gets rid of some ideas of like laissez-faire. Wagner Act is going to make it to where the United States supports unions, which for a long time the United States had not supported unions, especially with that Gilded Era time. 1937, we see FDR make a huge misstep, which is where he tries to add people to the Supreme Court. People thought of this as him trying to get rid of checks and balance and becoming a dictator. He lost some popularity after this. 1939, World War II is going to start in Europe. Hitler invaded Poland. France and Great Britain go to war. The United States stays out. We're trying to stay neutral. Again, we didn't sign the Treaty of Versailles. We didn't join World War I. We're trying to follow that Monroe Doctrine. But we do begin to support the Allied powers, which was France and Great Britain, by doing this thing called cash and carry. This was this idea that they could come pick up weapons from the United States and bring it back. This is going to advance even further in March of 1941 with the Lend-Lease Act. I think this is a great cartoon. It spells out everything, which is basically America is giving a big cannon to Great Britain. Hitler is saying you're playing with dynamite. And what the United States is saying back is it would be dynamite if we didn't do this. Basically, it's more dangerous not to act than to act. And then December 1941, Pearl Harbor is attacked. It was a surprise attack by the Japanese. We had done an oil embargo on Japan earlier. They retaliated by attacking us in a way to try to make it to where we could not attack them back, but we did, and we'll talk about that in just a second. Almost immediately after Pearl Harbor, we are going to intern all Japanese Americans. This means that they are going to have to go live in these isolated desert camps. We did this because we were fearful that they were actually spies. And then we did attack the Japanese back pretty quickly in 1942 with the Battle of Midway. This is actually the turning point. So the Battle of Midway is one of the first times we fight the Japanese, and it's also one of the biggest fights that we have against the Japanese, where we are going to sink some of their battleships and aircraft carriers. And then we have D-Day, 1944. This is when we invade France. The United States helped lead this invasion of France to try to get France back from Germany. This was kind of the beginning event for Hitler. 1944, we create the GI Bill, which really sets up post-World War II society, which is that we're going to take care of veterans when they get home. We're going to help them get houses. We're going to help them to get college educated. So you're going to have a mass increase in the amount of people who have houses and college educated. 1945, Truman becomes president. I like seeing the months of this. So Truman becomes president in 1945 in April. FDR died. One thing I want you to notice here that's very, very influential is that when FDR died, these are people who are actually at his funeral. Notice that it's white and black people. FDR got a lot of black people to come to the Democrat Party, something that's still consistent to this day. May 1945, victory in Europe. Germany surrenders. Hitler has killed himself. So now that there is no more war in Europe, we're going to focus on Japan. August 1945, we drop nuclear bombs on Japan. World War II is over. And that ends your timeline for this unit.